Well, welcome everybody to this CUSP, TRN and SLL book launch. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we're gathering on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land and pay our respects to their elders past and present. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here. I am standing in up to Stanley Valdez from the SLL and the School of Spanish. And normally Wesley has the enormous pleasure of introducing all our wonderful speakers, and he's asked me to stand in for him today, so he doesn't have to introduce himself. So let me begin. Wesley Lim, as many of you would know, is a lecturer in German studies here at the ANU. His research analyses representations of and discourses on dance and the moving body in Germanic literature and screen from the 19th century all the way through to the 21st century. His first book, this one pictured here, which he will talk about today, is Dancing with the Modernist City, Metropolitan Dance Texts Around 1900, published by the University of Michigan Press this year. He is currently working on the first comprehensive study of East German figure skating culture, and yet another project which looks at Asian sporting masculinities in figure skating. Wesley is joined by Meindert Peters, who is Leverhulme Early Career Fellow in German and Performance and Junior Research Fellow at New College at Oxford University. His first book is entitled Habituation in German Modernism by Camden House this year also. And it explores early 20th century imaginaries around habit and skill. His current book-length project is called Dancing Modernist Literature, under contract with Edinburgh University Press. And it looks at 21st century dance performances of European modernist literature in theory and in practice. He is editor of Brill's Bodies and Abilities book series, co-curator of Kafka, Making of an Icon, exhibition in Oxford and in New York. He's a former professional ballet dancer, choreographer and teacher, and he is also Wesley's RSHA external visitor here at ANU. Just for the purposes of the format, we're going to have a wonderful conversation between these two folk, and then a session for questions and answers at the end. Over to you, and please help join me in welcoming these gentlemen.
Thank you. Thanks, Thomas, for the introduction. Yeah. So, dear colleagues, student friends, and family, thank you so much for coming to this book launch. I've been working on this for a very, very, very long time, and I'll get into a little bit of the history of this. Thanks to the RSHA for hosting and funding Meindert's trip to Canberra, of course. And thanks to Cast Marketing, Erica, for arranging the time to do the filming for this. And all the SLL staff for organizing the event today. This book has been a very long time coming, and there is a huge village to thank. First, my acquisitions editor, Christopher Dreyer at the University of Michigan Press, who understood the project from its inception, and Katie LaPlante, who saw the book into production. The anonymous reviewers, obviously, I'm truly grateful for their feedback and how they pushed this project further. The Berlin Program for Advanced German and European Studies, Dissertation Research Fellowship at the Free University from 2008 to 2009, 2010, and of course the coordinator there, Karin Goer. Of course, my Doktormutter, Maike Werner, she opened my eyes to what modernism is, and helped me bring my experience as a dancer, as a former dancer, into a lot of my own research. And encouraged me basically to research dance and literature in her Fin de siècle seminar in 2005. And she did something to me that I very much respect, but I think at the time I did it very begrudgingly. She sent me to Berlin to improve my German and to have these wonderful types of experiences with the city, and I'm truly grateful. Mila Ganeva, Nicole Thez, and Sheila Johnson were instrumental in helping get this from dissertation more into a manuscript form. The ANU Screen Working Group, Katarina Bonzo, Kate Warren, Fabrizio Tocco, Gemma King, Monique Rooney, and Leslie Barnes for helping assisting to read with my work. All the colleagues in SLL, Catherine Chavez and Cap Bode for their great mentorship. This continues. And of course, Katie Sutton and Maureen Gallagher for being, I think, the best Germanist colleagues that have ever lived. Thank you for reading all of my work, and thank you for being along this very long journey of book publishing and hearing me talk about my experiences with all of this. So that's great. Thomas Nuri Valdez and Josh Brown as well for their emotional support in trying to get this project finished. The Dance and Movement Studies program at Emory University, where I learned to first dance. This was 2003. I'm indebted to them forever. My parents, Sally and Benny Lim, hello, for letting me starting to take ice skating lessons. This is the inception of where I learned to do any kind of movement, which translated into dance. This is at 2003. My brother, Wesley Lim, former DJ, actor, and now IT guy. I'm indebted to him because he also had this very artistic vein and didn't make me feel alone when I wanted to do all these artistic things. So very happy. And Sebastian Herold, who was unfortunately not here. A long relationship, a long distance relationship for 10 years, and just happy he's able to join me. Whew, okay, we gotta get together.
Thanks, Wesley, for being here. Congrats on this amazing achievement, first of all. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy and read it, and it will stay with me in the next months and years, thinking about all the wonderful things that are in the book. I think it's, especially its emphasis on dance and the urban environment, it's unique in German studies and English studies as well. So I'm just going to ask you some questions about the book. And let's start easy by, could you give us a quick summary of what's in the book? And maybe...
So authors and artists were interested in coming to Berlin and Paris, so large metropolitan cities, around 1900 for primarily work, and at these times there was industrialization going on, and they were interested to have these kinds of intellectual connections with other people, and dancers were also touring a lot of their works, particularly from the US. And what was interesting to me, that was interesting to a lot of writers, was they were interested in the urban experience at this time, figuring out what was going on psychologically, how they were reacting to these different kinds of stimuli happening within the city, these kinds of dynamic developments. And alongside these dancers came as well, and they watched these performances as well. And so one of the things I was interested in looking was basically, was there any kind of confluence? Was there any influence that these modern dancers were having of these performances that these authors were seeing? Was there any kind of influence that was happening also with the city that they were living in, with the stuff that they were experiencing? And basically, I basically was looking at how, what I'm calling this metropolitan dance text, which pulls from Andres Hussen's idea of the modernist miniature and Gabriele Brandstätter's idea of the dance text, and kind of smushed them together and created this kind of hybrid designation. And what's interesting here is that the dances that the authors are writing about are not happening on a traditional stage. Of course, this is still happening as well, but it's more of the imaginary taken outside of that to describe, but what are the possibilities of dance happening outside of the stage, and what's happening within the literature. That's so interesting. And so what happens is that dancers are in the street, they're on advertising pillars, they're dancing in squares, they're dancing in hospitals, is kind of how I'm pushing this argumentation. And they're also having this, what I'm looking at is this post-humanist kind of experience with the environment, so environment and city space more broadly as well, making the argument that these dances are kind of happening with each other, with the city. Yeah. So in some cases it's not necessarily happening with the city, but you can also absolutely see that it's having a very large, through the representation and how the authors are representing this is having a very large impact on how this person is moving. And on top of that, it's done in a dancerly type of movement, performative kind of fashion, and that was that's how I was reading everything,
Nice. Yeah, I want to get into the details in a bit, but I just want to ask you, you introduced it as being a long time in the making, but could you tell us a bit about, the process?
Yes. So I think, like my Dr. Mutter had urged me to also write about this certain dance scene, the Feitstanz scene,
Can you
And
just
so-
explain to us?
I did, yeah. So it's basically Meindert Peters is the protagonist in the story, and he is a younger writer, and he moves to Paris, and he, much like all the other artists that had moved and authors that had moved there, had been like living in the city, trying to figure things out, find it actually quite alienating trope of modernism. And basically he's trying to figure things out, and he's on the street looking at this guy that has a very strange gait. In fact, it doesn't actually look like anything's wrong until he's specifically aware that something is actually wrong with his gait. It ends up being quite jarring, fragmented, and it ends up being what you would probably recognize today as Huntington syndrome or Chorea-Huntington syndrome. What was the question? I already forgot the question. I'm just talking.
Yeah, Dr. Mutter said right about this, but the real question was like, how did the book come about?
Yeah. So writing about that, and then I thought, well, there could be something larger that's seen with all of this, the confluence of looking at dancing and then within the city. And so then I started just looking for specific things happening within modernist literature where that was happening. And what was really interesting is that even though it was like a performance, they always seemed to end up using the word tanz, or they would use dance, even though it was not necessarily like that. So I took that and said, well, if they're doing it then as such, then I'll view it as such, but then add more on top of that, right? And so maybe a complication and maybe a problematization of terminology, but at the same time, I'm still going to work with that, right? Yeah, which makes it interesting, yeah.
Yeah, nice, and it brings all these various things together, right?
Yeah.
So you already mentioned the Metropolitan Dance text there in your subtitle. But yeah, can you tell us a bit more about that, what the concept does for you? You've talked about house and where it comes from, but can you tell us a bit more about,
Sure.
and also maybe like how we can take that term to other novels or languages?
Well, I guess what's really interesting, and what I chatted with my students today as well, is there's something really interesting about the city. And if you look at the abbreviation and how everything is very centered on the other senses besides the text that are going on, that are enacted through pre-expressionist or early expressionist and expressionist types of work, that argues for that kind of performativity related to just the smallness of the text. And arguably because the text is so small, then you have, and arguably something I could probably chat with you about, is why, during dance performances, if you look historically through dance and through theater tends to end up having historically very longer types of duration, right? And dance has always been short, right? Mm-hmm. That's one of the things, yeah. And we look at the conciseness of the text and the experience of writing about that, being in the city, etc., maps on quite interestingly to how a dance can affect someone whilst they're watching it, dancing it. Yeah.
Nice. And then I think related to metropolitan dance text is the concept of the flaneur, which I think many of us will be familiar with, comes from Baudelaire and Benjamin's reading of Baudelaire as well, and has been an influential term throughout the 20th century.
Yeah.
But I think it does something specific in your book, quite interesting.
Yeah.
So do you want to elaborate on that?
Sure. I think it deviates from that because I think the flaneur has always been conceptualized as a white, privileged man that did not have that much to do, was independently wealthy, but was able to kind of go out and have the senses be played with, also another privilege. And what I was trying to bring back and look at this was, it was about the movement, etc., but I think it was also about the lens in which that was happening. So it didn't necessarily have to be related to the movement. It could have been the imagination of the movement, but also in the case of the Endo, when he's just sitting at I think I called him a sitting flaneur, and I was like, that's basically being a flaneur, is even if you're sitting at the cafe, you're waiting for stuff to come by. And this comes back to the contemporary sense, like you're people watching in a cafe, like you're very interested in just to see from the sociological view of what these people are doing, and that kind of still fits into that. And then on top of that, adding the queer and the wouldn't say feminist, but the more feminine aspect, that it's a woman watching this as well. It's not just the man that can also do this, and the queer perspective on top of that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. And that's, I mean, it's because you take the Metropolitan dance text, you kind of take dance out of its theater onto the city, and then the flaneur also, and correct me if I'm wrong, but also takes the role of kind of the spectator, right? In this new configuration of yeah, nice. And you kind of talk very nicely, I think, about the shifting positionalities of performer, flaneur, spectator, and city, and how they work together, and it kind of, unsettles this spectator watcher dichotomy, or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And also everyday people become dancers, kind of too.
Absolutely, yeah.
I quite like that.
And we see that like primarily in the endotext, right? Because it's like it suddenly transforms into something else.
Can you just tell everybody what Endel's text is?
Yeah, so Endel's sitting at a cafe, and it's quite programmatic what he's doing. He's not just being very vague about it. He's saying, I'm sitting at the cafe and I'm watching these people, and they start moving, and it's the movement. It's influenced by French Impressionism, like largely. We're talking about Berlin, which has actually historically been described as being ugly, proletariat, prosaic. No, it's not poetic like Paris is. So there's always been this not battle, but comparison. And these people, they kind of turn into basically, I don't know, maybe even natural types of. I'm not sure exactly, right? But they turn into something not human anymore, and they become kind of sweeping gestures of larger types of movement. This is what I'm thinking about. Moving around.
I mean, there's some wonderful descriptions of bodies blending into space as well, and we have it's the wonderful cover of a picture of Louis Fuller. And I think you recognize in there, and I think you're right, like a urban cityscape there in the left top. I don't know.
But I wasn't the one that actually thought it was Anne Cooper Albert. I thought about that first, and she only said it in her book very briefly, and she said it was also anachronistic, and I was like, well, there's something still kind of there, kind of strange and fascinating about that.
And then you talk about, in chapter 2, you talk a lot about architecture. There's this Louis Fuller pavilion, which I had never heard of. And it's amazing. And some other Atelier Elvira, which maybe you want to elaborate on what it is. But I was wondering about the architecture of the urban scape and how you think about that in your book. And
I think also just because I have a huge fascination with Jugendstil Architektur, Art Nouveau, and just something about the fact that if you think of Jugendstil and you think of the curves involved and the nature involved, for me, I constantly think of movement. I cannot see this not moving, because if you think of line, you think of linearity, masculinity as well. You think of it being static, but then when you start seeing curves, it's almost like I cannot stop seeing this kind of movement, right? So I think that's one kind of thing that happens and helps with that. The other is that the Louis Fuller Pavilion and then as well as Elvira Atelier, they were working on something to be quite gross and magnanimous, right? They were trying to also kind of fit themselves back into the city, the kind of artistic lens of how everything was working in the city. So I think that's another kind of argument that I was trying to work with, to say that was also complementary too as well. So visually as well as like aesthetically experiencing that kind of architecture.
It's wonderful. And also, this just occurred to me. So tell me if this is nonsense. But I was thinking about, because they're like pavilions and temporary, right? So there's also something about architecture as a performance, maybe.
That's one of the things that's really interesting. I mean, that Louis Philippe Pavilion and the Elvira, they were all They were all contemporary. Like they were there to be to be kind of really garish and to be out there, but at the same time they were like, oh, well, these aren't going to be there. So basically the memory of these types of architecture is basically only remembered in photography. So you're relegated back to this concept, Angela, view of like the documentation as such is only through photography because it's no longer been kept up and talked about. So it's through that kind of ghostly narrative that still gets talked about. And on the other hand, besides being kind of like huge, it's also just interesting to think about because I think we remember things more when they're lost, and for some reason we want to remember them even more as such because the memory of such is also so fragmented. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to talk more about like the archive later.
Yeah.
We'll get back to dance as lost. But one thing that's also, I think, very important in your text is queer performance.
Yeah.
Well, there's Harry Kessler, first of all, and then Else Lasker-Schüler, and her alter ego, Prince Yusuf.
Yeah.
And Nijinsky, of course.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you want to elaborate a bit on the triangulation maybe of queerness, dance, and the urban space, particularly, because I think.
Yeah, no, I think when I was writing, I was not necessarily thinking of that so specifically, because it wasn't until later on that 5 years later, after having done the dissertation and then coming back to the dissertation, and then reading more just about queer theory, having such a great colleague like Katie Sutton, who's recommending, and Erwin Malachi, that are recommending me these things to read and basically taking me outside and being like, oh, well, this is actually happening in my text. I had no idea what's going on. I'm writing about dance, but then there's all this really extra interesting stuff that's going on there. So that's kind of the extra layer that comes on later. And I don't know, when I think about, there was a book by Elizabeth Wilson called Sphinx, and I forgot the name, Sphinx in the City, related to that. And it basically, dichotomizes basically parts of the city that are feminine and parts of the city that are masculine, which is productive, but can also lead to compartmentalization, I think. And so it's interesting to think about the fact that can also be pulled out and re-examined. And so I'm thinking of performing Queer Modernism by Penny Farfen, who basically is looking at that specific paradigm of looking how that's actually working. And I'm thinking the city as itself is such a malleable type of experience that maybe that is something that works with queerness as well. I'm actually not sure. And it's not coming in the book, I'm just kind of thinking of this now. That actually kind of can be worked with as well. Because if it is designated historically as being masculine and feminine in some ways, and they both are these things, right? Then in some sense that is already like making it queer because it also has so many of these quite in-betweenness maybe of reading one thing, but actually it's also on the other hand, it's the same thing as well. So yeah I don't know if that's a way to think of it, and maybe someone's already written about it, I have no idea. I
mean, the other book you mentioned is Sarah Ahmed's Queer Phenomenology, which I'm a big fan of. Which brings me maybe to my next question, which is about improvisation. And I've been quite interested in thinking about the massive changes in environments around 1900 and how this might tie into and thinking about improvisation and how dance, new forms of dance might tie into that.
I think that totally works. Particularly if you're thinking of yourself, or these authors are thinking of themselves dancing with the city as well, then that's a perfect paradigm that actually kind of works, right? Improvisation at the time as such, right, didn't exist. It was something that grew out later, but it's a lens that you can apply to it later, to an earlier subject as well. So that totally does make sense. I think from what you just said about the queer performance, I thought maybe there's something. Well, we can talk about more about this, about finding your own
way in the urban space, or your own niches, or your own, you know, away from mainstream culture.
Yeah, no, that's a way of looking at it, yeah.
So in your final chapter, you talk very engagingly, not just because you talk a lot about literature and the metropolitan dance text. The text, I think, first of all, is literature or diary writing also. But in the last chapter, you also talk about new media like photography and film, and drawing as well. So I was wondering, like, why did you choose to do that? What did it bring to your argument?
Sure, yeah, no, I think, well, when you come from a literature program, I think most of them, they tell you, Wesley, you have to write about literature. So, and the conception of what literature is then the canonized, obviously sometimes, mostly white men that you have to write about. So I think one of the things to deviate from that was to be like, well, can I, integrate other types of forms? And it's interesting because I looked at, there's a friend of mine doing a dissertation at UMass Amherst, and he was in comp lit, and he was writing about, like Trisha Brown, like she's writing about dancers, and I said, how can a comp lit program let you write about dance? And I was like, we're a literature program, we gotta write about literature, right? And then it's not until like you graduate, you finish that, which is what the dissertation was, and then you're like, oh, there's actually all this other stuff, cultural studies related stuff. That's actually really interesting. Why are we not analyzing this at the same time? Like, it's all kind of a larger umbrella. It's not just the literature, the compartmentalization of it, which in itself, right, super productive in what it is doing, but it's actually, if you want to broaden that and make a larger cultural studies argument, then that's what you end up kind of doing with it.
I mean, it works wonderfully.
Yeah, and I just think about all the other books that I've read recently. Elise George's book about the dancing body in Vienna, or not dancing body, but the medicalized body, but the gaze on the body, and just all the other current stuff that's coming out. And it is literature, but it's also almost everything else that's kind of coming out of it, and it's gorgeous. And I'm just like, yes, this is amazing. Like, it's affecting everything. So yeah.
So perhaps we can also talk a bit about the troubles you might have had in writing this. I mean, it's a trope of dance studies to say dance texts are, ephemeral, and we don't have access to the original text, which is, in this case, correct, right?
Yeah.
Before video, and you can still wonder if video actually gives us access to text. I'm straying. My question is, and what I want to say is, like, I think actually in your book it becomes a virtue because it becomes an imaginary in literature, and especially in literature, right? So, we don't have access to the original dance performances, but you're writing about how it shapes imaginaries in literature and beyond, right?
Yeah.
And so, I would just wanted you to talk a bit more about the trouble, if there is a trouble working with thinking about dance, but maybe also generally about issues you encountered, difficulties that help us when we're writing our books to think that we're not alone in this.
Yeah. No, totally. I think at the beginning of dance studies, we'd always been very concerned with having some kind of source. So the Erinnerungstext I talked about, so it has to be something related to the phenomenon that you are talking about because of the ephemerality. And I think we still do that. We still have a huge preoccupation, especially from the historical standpoint, to want to recreate things in the way that we would like them to be, and then to be argued about them later. But then there was a turn at some point that was, we should also embrace, or Lucia Uple also talks about this, there's an imaginary related to it. And if you do think about it, right, if you're writing these kinds of text, there is these metropolitan dance texts. I can't imagine that Rilke is right there, like he's in the street, he's watching, he's like, oh, this is great, right? You're not doing that, right? This is the type of thing the traditional 19th century writer will think about this, ponder it, and then at some point later on start writing about it at home. And then it has to be reimagined. It cannot, it's relying on memory and then writing about it, and then it comes out into something else. So I would say, embrace that as much as you can, but also see how much, is actually there, and see how much you can actually dig up archivally. Yeah.
But can you tell us a bit more about any troubles you might have had? Or was it smooth? Was it smooth?
No, I think there was a lot of ultra reliance on like looking at the text, and this is what we learned from literary studies. And I think, on the one hand, that's where we're looking. We're looking at context within that, and we're kind of looking at the text really intensely. And of course, I am coming from a little bit of dance studies, but I think I'm primarily like in literary studies and cultural studies. And then I read this really interesting article by Anne Albright again, who basically said, which is interesting, and I kind of agreed with her. She said that literary studies people fetishize the text too much, and there's a lack of embodiment with everything going on. And I said, oh, okay. So did I actually go from there? But then I thought about it, and I was like, well, no, I came from the embodied practice. But on the other hand, I was like, no, I actually think I put myself in the shoes of some of these authors. I went to Berlin, I sat there, I looked at people, I watched them move. There was a little bit of anthropological, ethnographic stuff going on here, and I was like, no, there was a bit of practice there as well. But I think it was more, not that I'm trying to recreate this, it's more kind of like, there's an experiential part of that in there that I didn't consciously do, I just did because we're dancers and that's how we view things. But I didn't think of taking that and then putting it onto the literature, because then you lose a little bit of what the literature is, right? Like it's the practice that happens, but then it ends up being that you end up writing about it. Yeah, you would, I mean, right. There's different practices now, and I think you could do something where it was creative and it was auto-ethnographic, and then you add this other part too. It's just not something that I would necessarily do in my field, but I think it's interesting, and I think it's happening now, and I think it's great that you can actually have the creative, and then you can also have the analytical happening. Yeah, and I think people in our department are sort of looking at PhDs that way. So I mean, yeah, same. Yeah.
I think we have some time.
Yeah.
One question I wanted to ask is about inspiration. I guess it's also, you've mentioned a lot of dance scholars, other people that you've engaging with, but I thought I might give you an opportunity to tell us a bit more about texts that you thought were like secondary texts that you were inspired by, that you modeled your book on, any chance you want to thank specific colleagues?
I
mean, you've mentioned the many. But
yeah, I don't know. I think the text, it's going to sound trite, maybe the text wrote itself in the sense of I was the vessel? I don't know. Does that sound horrible? Nah. Yeah, just everyone we've mentioned. Lucia Rupek's been really influential in how I'm thinking about things, what I'm reading. Kate Ellsworth's work, of course.
Who we haven't mentioned yet, I think. But
and we've just mentioned that, great, yeah. So,
we'll get
just everyone I've mentioned, yeah, and and it's weird. I think my passion for what I'm writing about and thinking about things comes from this interrogation of like really looking at it intently, then looking at everything around it, and then I'll be like, okay, now what theoretical text do I need? What kind of approaches do I need? And then I'll do that instead of the other way around. I think is the way I'm looking at things. Yeah, yeah.
So you all have these wonderful cards, which on the back have a photo of Wesley dancing. And can you tell us a bit about this photo, please?
Yeah, sure. So that was in 2009, and Sebastian, my partner, and I were traveling around. We did the Schönes Wochenende ticket, so from Berlin to Saarbrücken, which is the cheapest way you could travel at the time, which was 29 euros.
Why Saarbrücken? Sorry?
Because that's right on the edge, and we had a friend there, and then we went to Metz, and then we went over the border, and then we went to Paris, and then I think at this time we were kind of obsessed with doing modernist/postmodernist poses with things in Paris, and I was like, oh, this is kind of cute. So this incidentally I was looking at this door, and it was with my bag, and so I was doing this strange thing with my bag. And then this is actually the third picture of a trilogy in which I decided to move this way, and I was looking at this door, and we were doing this crazy kind of Jugendstil Architektur thing where I was just looking at really famous buildings. And this is crazy. I just love doing this. And then also I did this in Belgium as well. I spent 2 days in Belgium, in Brussels, and I looked at all these beautiful Jugendstil-Architektur buildings because they had not been destroyed during the war. And so they were still standing, and I was like, this is great. Anyway, so in the photo, basically, I'm doing this kind of like back bend position. And I think Meindert had asked me if I were to do a movement right now to encapsulate the book, that would be it, I think.
Can you please do it?
Do I have to do it now? I didn't practice this. But anyway, I'll do the movement, but that's
improvisation.
Improvisation. But if you actually look closely at the picture, there's two Bauarbeiter or tradies that are looking out the door. So that's why I'm looking to the left, because I'm going to embarrass myself, but I want to get the shot and look really cool. And then, that's the moment we did it.
Amazing. We'll go into questions from the audience in just a minute, but my final question is, what's next? After this book, you published your book,
yeah.
and now is this going anywhere else, or are you?
I mean, I'm moving on to like figure skating, so the sporting body, as you know, and so looking at East German figure skating, which I've also published in. And before I danced, and did a bunch of movement stuff. I did figure skating as well, so that was one of the things I got really interested in, looking at gender and reading some influential books, and then realizing this is something I've always wanted to write about. And it was really cool, and there was, and because academics some academics are very niche-y and they have their own kind of quirks, etc. Mine was when I was younger, I used to record figure skating performances, and I would have mountains and mountains of these. VHSs, by the way, in case you remember what those are, which are actually still archived at my parents' house. And I was like, even as a sixth grader, I was already obsessed with like recording and watching these things over and over and over and over. And I said, well, I have to write a book about this. I've like watched these videos for like ever. I was like, there has to be something good that comes out of this. So, yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Great, thanks a lot.
Are there any questions? That was great. Any questions? Yes.
That was so fabulous, thank you. I have a question, and I don't know anything about this field, so forgive me if it's ignorant, but about what you said about the history of improvisation. And just wondering if you could say a bit more about that the history of when improvisation in dance became, was established, and how that relates to modernist literature and the kind of technologies or techniques of modernism in literature.
That's a really good question, and I don't remember exactly when it happened. I just remember, and you can also help me here, it just ended up being a technique course that you probably took, I took, and it was also one of the ways that a lot of contemporary dancers now actually come up with their movement, right? So it ends up being, if they're having trouble thinking of something that they want to do, and it ends up being a part of, their creative processing. I would say almost everyone I've looked at uses improvisation in some way to create their movement instead of necessarily looking at that.
Yeah, because now it's kind of a formalized thing, as you say. But I guess Louis Fuller being with her things. I don't. That
was all actually choreographed.
Really?
All of that is
okay.
yeah. So I think the improvisation happens. Basically also just with the linear running. If we're looking at it having that lens and looking at everything that way, then that's where it kind of would lie, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, yeah, that's a fascinating thinking.
Yeah.
Thanks, Wesley, thank you so much. Thanks for the conversation. I'm a pretty ignorant person. I would like you to explain to me your title of the book. I haven't read the book. Why is it called Dancing with the Modernist City?
Sure,
What I'm concerned with is, in a great civilization like the German, how it descended to the level within less than 40 years into something quite terrible. What happens? Because at the moment we know what's happening in America and other places, including India. So, do you have any hints of what was going to happen within Germany in the next 20, 30 years? Do you touch that at all?
Within the title, not so much. I think that's one of the things that I remember when we're writing the book. Everyone was like, "Oh, Wesley, stop at 1914," because there always seems to be, I think, from a historical standpoint, that tends to be the Cäsur, this where everything is happening. And so, if you go beyond that, it ends up being a completely different conversation because of World War I. So you can't even the Belle Epoche, right? You can't. They're in that sense they're kind of separated because of what's happening. So that's how they get compartmentalized, and that's how this is actually viewed as well. I think, which could be reintroducing tropes again of how there's lack of discontinuity between these two. But I think because there is such a very pronounced Cäsur here, that I'm following in with that as well. Yeah. And someone can jump in there and say, "Wesley, that's wrong." And so.
Well, I mean, the worry is always to read backwards, right? To read from the disaster back into these texts.
The reason I raised that,
Yeah.
if I may take one more minute, there is a book called Dance of Shiva
Okay.
by
Yeah.
Ananda Kumar Swami, very
Yeah.
famous. And I think it's been translated into German also. In that, he shows that Dance of Shiva, the Greek god,
Yeah.
who sits on Mount Everest, is both creative and destructive.
Sure. Yeah.
You know, that the element of art.
Absolutely.
It
Yeah.
can be both creative and destructive, and Germany went, the Berlin certainly
Yeah.
went through that kind of process so soon
Yeah.
after the great movements.
Well, I think the reading and that I do with some of the texts is actually some of this pessimistic viewing as well, because it is this kind of like the sweeping, beautiful movement, and on the other hand, a lot of the protagonists are also undergoing really psychological trauma. So there is a bit of that being hinted at through expressionism. So that could be also, that could be one of the things I could think about, and how that's actually hinting at it, how dance is actually all-encompassing of what humanity is trying to portray through its movement, and you can see that. So I think that's super helpful though. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, Thomas. Yeah.
Thank you. Fantastic conversation. Thank you to both of you. I had a question about the phrase you spoke about briefly, which was the embodied practice. Of
Yeah.
How it affected your methodology and your approach to these dances.
Yeah.
And I speak as somebody who, contrary to the stereotype, I'm a Latin American with 2 left feet. So I can't
Oh yeah.
so I was wondering whether you had any kind of more illustrative examples of the ways in which your own dance background, I guess, because you spoke about being in Berlin.
Yeah.
That being an embodied experience of what the text was describing. But I wonder whether your own experience of dance and movement had many things to bring to bear on your interpretation of the text themselves as well, and whether there's 1 or 2 case studies that maybe might interest us.
Yeah, sure. I think it did. I think it just opens you, particularly because my program was mostly contemporary and modern studies, dance, was that we did do ballet, but on the other hand, the emphasis was basically just on modernist technique and thinking about how that is actually working. And so I think already thinking about that I think one of the things that I still have a lot of trouble seeing, but one of the theorists, Udo von Laban, always talks about that this space, and he imagines the space is actually being, and this is what helps inform basically looking at how inanimate objects and how space can actually have influences and be dancing, is that he says the space is active, it's activated once we start moving, and it moves with us. So he's looking at this from a very mathematical point of view of looking at, and this works in ballet as well, the different planes on which the body is set up within space, and looking at these planes as being the space that we're moving and how that's being activated. And a lot of dancers talk about how the space is, you're right. So it ends up sucking you in, it ends up doing things with you. I still have trouble sometimes seeing that, I think. But I think that's one of the things that is really difficult for other people to see and to imagine what that actually means, I think. And I still have trouble with it as well.
But actually,
Yeah.
that image on the back of the card actually shows
Yeah.
that kind of, right? So you stand in
Sure.
front of Jugendstil, and what's the movement that comes to you, right? It's a wave. It's
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's a nice illustration of your knowledge as a dancer.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Yeah, would you say there's a two-way flow? I mean, a literary text, what's in the text can be expressed in dance. And can dance then influence the text?
Absolutely. I think it happens all the time. Yeah.
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 Thank you.
I mean, Meindert is working on literary adaptations, literary adaptations of dances. So it's
Other way
also-
around.
yeah.
Dance
Oh,
adaptation.
sorry. Exactly. Yeah.
We can talk more about I have two questions, one on my left and one on my right. And just how we go left first?
Sure, well, I guess I mean, you know, I'm fascinated by the Weimar Republic, but I also know that you've been thinking a bit about this recently and shows like Babylon, Berlin, where dance does play a big role.
Yeah.
And I guess, and you know, you said this book finishes really at around 1914, and your most recent work picks up on the kind of East German and much more recent period, but you have looked at this period in between as well. And I guess, what do you think that dance, especially for contemporary audiences, can convey about this very sort of dynamic and tumultuous period that other, I mean, in media like film and television, that other forms of representation can't. You know, why is dance so pivotal to these series? What is it doing there?
Yeah, sure. So it's, in many cases, I would say it's lacking any kind of words. So there's that kind of linguistic barriers then überschritten. So you're not thinking about that. And just, I guess, I don't know, maybe the experiential nature of watching these. So, and the thing is, I haven't obviously never watched any of these dances because some of them are imaginary, etc. But then theoretically, you'd have to go back and say, well, there is aura, and you'd have to be thinking about that, and you'd have to be thinking about the atmosphere, what's going on as well. And so I can only reproduce so much of that to relay the kinds of effect that it would have on someone aesthetically or politically at the time. Yeah. But that does make a lot of sense, yeah. And it's interesting to think about how dance, what dance's contribution is in comparison to other kinds of art forms, etc. What's there, what's lacking in terms of that, and how is it reaching its audiences in that kind of way? Yeah.
Yeah, like why set key scenes of that show in a club,
Hmm.
and why key
Yeah.
scenes, dance scenes?
There is this
Yeah.
trope of the dancing on the volcano, right?
Yeah.
Like dance as if there's no tomorrow, joy. Final question, I think, yeah.
Thanks so much to you both. I really enjoyed that. Wesley, these skinny jeans really date this. It's really late for once. Take it back. I loved how you described the Jugendstil as this kind of almost this dancing architecture, and
Yeah.
that's such a that was like such an enlightening and beautiful metaphor. But I myself am like a terrible kind of fetishizer of text, and I just kind of do literature. I was wondering about how modernist literature and modernist poetry comes in, and is it like does dancing in modernist literature become a kind of key metaphor or something, or a key trope as well? I don't know if there's anything on that in the book.
In terms of how it situates itself amongst
Well, in
other
terms of, like,
genres, or
the thinking of modernist authors, does it become a key frame for sort of understanding and representing the world?
okay.
Metaphor, perhaps.
Really broad question, and I really like it. I'd have to kind of investigate that more. I think it does in some ways for some authors. Obviously, the ones I've been connecting with, in the queer space, it would absolutely, and also just for the ones like Elsa Lasker and Verreke, they were both poets, like primarily poets, and so there's something about the performativity of that poem, and something about the shortness and conciseness of what's going on in that poem. That lead them to want to do that. And I think, particularly with modernist texts, with being abbreviated, small, not allegorical, aphoristic. There's something an abbreviated nature. Has something emotionally kind of like stirring, jarring, whatever you want to call it, probably within it. So I think that's why modernist text has that kind of connection probably with dance at the time, because it is so immediate in that case, and performative also within the words,
Thank you.
I think that's it. So I hear people have to go to their classes.
Y'all gotta go teach, right? Yeah.
Let's give a big applause for Wesley.